Her research interests are in plant geography, conservation biology, rare plants of Western North America, taxonomy of monkey flowers, pollination biology, and in general, the flora of the Mojave Desert and transverse ranges in Southern California. And as I said, I'm privileged to collaborate with her on a rare plant project that we do with Triple Rib Milkvetch with Center for Conservation Biology. And I was also able to visit the beautiful space that she works in at California Botanic Garden and meet some of the great graduate students that she mentors at her institution. And in her spare time, part of it, I think, is spent tending her beautiful irrigation-free native plant garden that she tends in Claremont, California. And with that, I'll leave it to Dr. Frege to give us her talk.
Thank you so much for that really nice introduction, Lynn. And I am very honored to be invited to give this presentation today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started here. All right. Does that look okay, everyone? I hope so. I think so. Okay. Well, it's a great honor to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. Plant conservation, and specifically, I'm going to focus on rare plant conservation. There we go. Sorry. There we go. Okay. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge that the work that I conduct at the California Botanic Garden and at my home in Pomona is on the traditional homelands of the Tongva. And so I'm coming to you today from an area that was known for its plentiful prickly pear fruits and prickly pear plants, primarily a plant called Opuntia littoralis. And I'm just very grateful that we still have hill slopes full of these prickly pears today, which these lands have been known for time immemorial. So I also want to dedicate this presentation to someone who has been an inspiration and who was a very important mentor to me, Barbara Drake, who was an elder of the Tongva tribe, and we just recently lost her last year in 2020. I had the privilege to work side by side with her, and she really taught me something that you can't learn from textbooks, and really helped me deepen my connection to plant diversity. And it's something I try to bring to my work, just sort of strengthening my connection to plants. And so I really thank Barbara for her perspective. She was really always a positive force, very optimistic. And I hope that with this presentation, despite all that's going on in the world with our historic drought situation, we're under a situation of global change. It's important that we have hope and are positive, because that's what's going to help us conserve plants into the future. And Barbara really taught me about that. So just a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to first just give an overview of the spectacular diversity that we have in this great state of California. It's really quite incredible, the plants that we have, and so I'll just kind of go over why we have such incredible plant diversity. I'll give a little bit of a brief overview. I work at a botanic garden and do conservation at a botanic garden, so I just would like to give a little bit of background on botanic gardens and their role in plant conservation. And then I have 3 case studies of 3 projects that I have worked very closely on that I think just demonstrate different aspects of plant conservation and the urgent need to conserve plants. So one would be a rare plant research project I'm working on with a plant called the Amaryllis nightwort, Nitrophyllum mojavensis. Work we're doing to seed bank the flora of California to save seeds into a magnificent seed vault. And then work I'm doing that's more recent in botanical advocacy surrounding a very rare plant called Team's buckwheat, or Ariaga teamii. So let's just start with this overview of California botany. Before I really got into rare plant conservation, the thing that really hooked me on plants was when I was a student, an undergraduate student at Cal Poly Pomona, and I came to learn about the incredible diversity that we have here in California. We have more kinds of plants than any other state in the United States. About a third of those only occur in California and nowhere else. And yet another third of those are considered rare, threatened, and endangered. So there's a lot of overlap between the plants that are restricted to California and the rare plants, but it's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. We have many rare plants that are rare in California, but might be more common elsewhere. They might occur in Nevada, Oregon, or Baja California. But also many of our endemic plants, they might be restricted to California, but actually have fairly wide ranges in California. So they're not necessarily that exact same subset, but it is, I think, quite incredible that we are the stewards of, over 2,000 plants that are just restricted to California, and we have such diversity here. On this slide is a very narrow endemic, the California Dandelion, Taraxacum californicum, which is endemic to Meadows in the San Bernardino Mountains. And I've done quite a bit of work with that plant. And so we have this incredible diversity, and I think probably many of you know is we have incredible diversity in climate, topography, geology, all these sort of things. And this is just comes from an Atlas of Biodiversity of California that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife put together, but I think it illustrates so well how heterogeneous our state is and the incredible gradient that occurs. And if we just even look at Southern California, we can see what incredible climate diversity we have in our Southern California region. And further, we have this incredible geologic diversity. So this is a picture taken in the San Bernardino Mountains, looking north towards the desert. And there's a lot of granitic rock in the San Bernardino Mountains, but there are really diverse rock types. And off in the distance here, you can see this grayish sort of rock, and that's a carbonate rock outcrop. Here on the north slope of the San Bernardino Mountains, these carbonate rock outcrops actually host a suite of species that only occur on carbonate rock in the north side of the San Bernardino Mountains and nowhere else. And many of those species are actually listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act because this rock type also happens to be sought after for mining cement. And so they have these incredible threats, and there's been a lot of important work done to help conserve these species, lots of great studies in the literature, but it just goes to show that our diversity in geology, while it provides great opportunities for plant diversity to evolve onto unique rock types, in certain instances, this diverse geology is also sought after for mining and presents a threat to plant diversity. And of course, we have great topographic heterogeneity. And in Southern California, I've done quite a bit of work, botanical work all across Southern California, especially in the Mojave Desert and the transverse ranges. And I'd just like to note the San Bernardino Mountains has Mount San Gorgonio, which is the highest peak in Southern California. And so we have, the lowest point in Death Valley, and then we have Mount Whitney, it's just very topographically heterogeneous. So really provides for incredible plant diversity here. And so there's this map of plant species richness, and we see that especially in the San Bernardino Mountains, we have incredible plant species richness. And while certain areas like the Mojave Desert doesn't really light up as an area of plant species richness, it's actually been well documented that the flora of the Mojave Desert has a lot of plant species that are very young and fairly recently evolved. And there's many endemic plants there. And so it's definitely an important place for our flora in California. And so we have this incredible diversity, but we know that threats exist, and these threats have existed for quite some time. Over a century ago, Theodore Payne, who was a prominent horticulturalist, botanist, who lived in Los Angeles, he did a lot of botanizing of the San Fernando Valley. And there's an institution to this day located in Sun Valley that, carries out his work, and he was a nurseryman, producing plants in their native plant nursery. And Theodore Payne has this quote where he says, "The rapidity with which the wildflowers are decreasing is most alarming. If we do not begin to preserve them, the time will soon be here where they will become extinct and live only in history. And so, you know, when Theodore Payne said this in 1916, he was observing rapid development in the greater Los Angeles basin. And so this is a photo of Los Angeles from 1929. And we can see how he probably was witnessing really incredible landscape change and rapid development. And this was around the time when the founder of California Botanic Garden, Susanna Bixby Bryant, she established the institution in 1927. And in establishing that institution, she felt first and foremost that conservation should be at the center of the work, and that she felt that there needed to be an institution that was dedicated to California native plants, to their understanding, to their cultivation, but also to their conservation. And so my work is to carry on that legacy, to really focus on plant conservation as it's central to our mission. So that brings me to thinking about botanic gardens and conservation and the different roles that botanic gardens can play in plant conservation. This is a picture of our botanic garden out in the California communities. We have some great Joshua trees and California fan palms. And if you haven't visited, I definitely would encourage you to check it out. We have quite the display, the largest botanic garden dedicated to California native plants. But the concept of botanic gardens has really been around, you know, from the time of various ancient civilizations. Here's a panel from ancient Egypt displaying plants that were displayed at a botanic garden. And but really, when we think about how our modern botanic gardens, for instance, Kew Botanic Garden is one of the largest botanic gardens in the world. Many of our modern botanic gardens were born out of European colonialism and during this time of exploration, and with the idea of kind of collecting specimens, with the idea of really had a focus of economic botany and sort of looking at landscapes and plants in terms of their value and what we can extract from that. But in doing that, botanic gardens had developed lots of different resources and are very good at cataloging and recording things, and have plant museums, you know, these herbaria that can catalog specimens and keep those records for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I think that botanic gardens today really, they have a different focus, and it really focuses on the botanic garden I work at and many other public gardens focus on education and bringing the public sort of into these plant settings to kind of display and educate about the importance of plants. And so I think that we have an opportunity, a real opportunity to secure plants from extinction through the variety of the work that takes place at botanic gardens. And in a lot of ways, I think botanic gardens have this duty as institutions, advocates, institutions dedicated to plants. And so we do conservation in a variety of ways at botanic gardens. One is we conserve gene pools. So we have these specimens in the garden, and they're not just simple specimens, you know, with intent to display, but we oftentimes are collecting genetically diverse samples. So they may represent many genetic individuals, or we have sort of representative populations. And it's very much an opportunity to have a living laboratory and to bring, you know, plants from California, from all different corners of California at the California Botanic Garden, and to have them growing side by side in common condition is really a great opportunity for research. We also do a lot of work in horticulture, environmental horticulture, where we're advancing knowledge on propagation of species. So we do a lot of work propagating plants, not only for our garden and for the public, but also for restoration. So we're actively propagating plants for the Angeles National Forest or different projects needed throughout Southern California. And it's a public-facing institution, so it's really an opportunity to engage and educate the public and provide information on how we interact with plants in everyday ways, the importance of plants in our lives, and the importance to conserve them. And botanic gardens aren't silos. We work in coordination, and there's lots of different ways we're working in networks. And one is we have used this framework of the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, which had a timeline until 2020, but it's going to be revised. But botanic gardens across the globe utilize this framework to advance their work. And then there's different networks like Botanic Gardens Conservation International, which is a global organization, and Center for Plant Conservation, which is a North American focused organization that bring botanic gardens together to network, to share and exchange information. And later on in my presentation, I'll talk about the California Plant Rescue, which is born out of these networks. For instance, it's a sort of a sub-network of the Center for Plant Conservation, where we're working to advance seed banking of the California flora. So now I'll transition into some of these case studies for plant conservation. And I'm going to talk about 3 different projects, and we'll start with the Amargosa nightwort. And this photo in the background is the Amargosa nightwort's habitat. And it's a sunrise, because when we do monitoring for the Amargosa nightwort, we do it in July. And this is actually located just outside of Death Valley National Park. And this year we did it in July, the week where it hit 130 degrees in the park. So needless to say, it was very, very hot, and we started our work in the dark. But the perks of that is that we get spectacular sunrises. So it was actually great. So this is the Amargosa nightwort in all of its glory. You can see its beautiful pink flowers. I love this plant. I definitely have a love affair with this plant. It grows out on these salt flats. It's an alkali wetland, and these soils are perennially wet. It has a ranking from the California Native Plant Society of 1B.1, which is the rarest ranking you can have. 1B plants tend to be endemic to California, versus there's also a ranking of 2, which means plants are rare in California but more common elsewhere, and a ranking of 4, which means that plants are on a watch list. So 1B is the rarest ranking. And then 0.1 is a threat rank. And so there's 1, 2, and 3, 1 being most threatened and 3 being the least threatened. And so having a ranking of 1B.1 means you're as rare as you can get and as threatened. And it's federally and state listed as endangered under both Endangered Species Acts. So this is definitely a plant in peril. And so I feel very fortunate to work with it and to help steward this plant and ensure that we have populations into the future. So I'll tell you a little bit about our work. This is a map to orient you as to where we are. So we're in this part of the world here in Eastern California, just outside of Death Valley National Park. And this is Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. So there's populations in Nevada. And this is the main population I work with. It's in California. So Death Valley's just down the road. This is Death Valley National Park, this green area. And then there's populations down here in Takopa. So this is Takopa Shoshone. Some of you might be familiar with this area in Eastern California. So this species occurs in a pretty remote location, and it's a pretty spectacular location. It's really phenomenal. Meadows National Wildlife Refuge is known for its spectacular wetlands. And this is quite a unique habitat because we're right here near the hottest and driest place on the planet, yet there are these really extensive wetlands that are fed by a really extensive carbonate groundwater aquifer. And so we have, these pools are filled by ancient water. This is water that was laid down in the Pleistocene over 10,000 years ago when there were lakes in the bottom of Death Valley and snow on top of all those mountain peaks. And the water is gushing out of springs at thousands of gallons per minute. And it feeds these lush wetlands. And so the Amargosa nightwort persists because it is supplied with this ancient water. And it occurs in an alkali wetland that the soil is muddy, and it's muddy in July in the heat of the summer, and it's muddy in December. It's just perennially wet. And I think that it's really spectacular. And this is all in a place that is just like I said, a few miles away from the hottest, driest place on the planet. So this plant is really contending with a lot of extremes in its environment. This is another picture of its habitat. This is in the winter. All these little brown blobs down here are the nidawort stems that have died back for the winter. But you can see this salt-crusted alkali flat, and it's salt crusted because there's just like a whole lot of evaporation going on here. This soil is saturated and wet, but it's constantly evaporating because of the heat, and it's leaving all these salts behind. So we have undertaken a study. We have funding right now from a grant with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through Section 6. That this is funding that's provided because it is a plant listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And the purpose of our study is really, even though this plant is listed and we know it's threatened, there's a lot of mysteries to this plant. There's a lot we don't know. So we're trying to increase understanding to learn more about population trends. Actually, we're doing work also to learn more about its distribution, looking at its reproduction, documenting threats, and then utilizing all this information to identify what the priority management actions are and making sure I'm doing the work, hopefully communicating to relevant parties to hopefully ensure that those get implemented. And there are many threats to the Amargosa nidawort, and the primary threat is really groundwater extraction or groundwater overdraft. So I talked about this extraordinary perennial water supply that's fed by ancient groundwater. Well, there's a lot of activity to withdraw that groundwater at a rate that's not sustainable. And, it's a finite supply because modern day recharge is very greatly diminished compared to what it used to be. So that means we're drawing off an account that's not replenishing at the same rate that you're taking out. And so that will lead to drying springs. And this water is being extracted for a variety of reasons. One is to support growing population areas, but also agriculture in the area. And there's also various commercial use. Obviously, climate change is a threat to all inhabitants of the planet, and is certainly a threat to the Amargosa nidawort. And we also have issues with off-highway vehicle incursion. There's a main road that intersects the population, and that provides an opportunity for people to just veer off the road and run over the nidawort. So there's fencing installed to prevent that, but sometimes the fencing comes down. And actually right across the way from the nidawort, there's a playa called Franklin Playa that has a mining claim on it for lithium. And while there's not any activity there now, I'd like to think that the plant's protection under the Endangered Species Act would prevent that mine from going through, because it would draw water that would really impact the population. There's just a lot of unknowns. And then there are wild horses throughout the region, feral animals that cause problems in the habitat. So this is just kind of a bird's eye view of satellite imagery of the area. I showed you that crystal pool. So this is Ash Meadows area right here, and the nidawort occurs downstream from that, kind of down here. But up here, you can see all this agriculture up here. This is Amargosa Valley. And this is alfalfa that's being grown for a dairy farm up here. And so the water that they're able to withdraw, that they're allocated, is actually greater. It's over allocated. The groundwater disbursements are over allocated in this region. And then we also have the growing city of Pahrump in Nevada that is just east of here. So those are the primary threats to the species. And it's really kind of, if you think about it, it's a very hard threat to kind of deal with or manage, because you can say, if you have off-highway vehicle incursion, you can create a fence and prevent that from happening. But there could be groundwater extraction happening 50 miles away, maybe even 100 miles away, that impacts this habitat. And it's very complicated, these groundwater systems. So by the time you notice water discharge is decreasing, you've already reached some threshold of withdrawal that might be difficult to reverse. So this is like a very difficult threat to wrap your head around. So we've been conducting lots of different kinds of monitoring. We instituted some growth plots in collaboration with the Bureau of Land Management to look at the phenology to see how the plant grows throughout the year. And we've learned about when it's at maximum growth and when it goes dormant and when it flowers. And we also, we have a monitoring program more extensive than the growth plots, where we're monitoring in these permanent plots to look at changes in frequency from year to year. And we're also conducting a much wider population survey to have a better map of where all the plants occur. And we've also done work to collect seeds, which has been really difficult. We've tried it 3 times and we only have 133 seeds in the seed bank, which is not very much. So this plant has a lot of mysteries about reproductive biology that we're also trying to find out. So this is just sort of a little schematic that shows the monitoring that we're doing. And we have these belt transects located in these macro plots, and they're 75 meters long and a ½ meter wide. And we go in there and we count every single night of work in every single belt transect. And normally it takes us, I'm going to say 4 to 5 days with about 6 to 8 people. And this year, the population, we knew the population was not doing well, that there was a great decline related to the drought. And it only took us 3 days with 4 people. So it just really varies depending on the abundance. But this is a look just to show you. I'm not going to kind of get deep into the numbers, but one thing that's interesting is this is a plant that is perennial and is supplied by groundwater that is supposed to be perennial, a perennial water supply. But yet there's great fluctuation in frequency in the abundance from year to year. So between years that has an asterisk, excuse me, indicates that there's a significant difference between years in terms of abundance. And so you can see that it is significantly different between a lot of different years. And this year, we have our 2021 numbers in there. You can see we have sort of a precipitous drop. And I think this is very much related to the drought. I've noticed the habitat was significantly drier this year. When we walked out, it wasn't slushy or muddy, and the salt crust just kind of went crunch, crunch, crunch. And I dug around and it was definitely drier. And so this might be related to evaporation, but it also might be related to things that might be happening at Ash Meadows upstream related to spring discharge that I'm not privy to. And so this is something that I'd like to investigate more, because it's definitely impacting the population for it to be dry. When it's dry at the site, the plants aren't doing well and they look stressed. Another thing we learned from doing the monitoring is that the plants in this macroplot 5, they're on the south side of this road. This is State Line Road, and they've been doing consistently declining in every year. And I think what's happening is that this road is bermed up, that is preventing water flow from sheeting across to the other side. And so it's drier on the south side of the road than it is on the north side of the road. And so hopefully we can propose some kind of infrastructure. This would probably entail collaborating with California Department of Transportation or the county or something like this to establish culverts or something that would allow water to pass through to the other side. So we have a lot of work left to do with the Amargosa Nidowort. This project certainly isn't done yet, and I probably will be visiting the Nidowort every year for the rest of my life because I've definitely grown attached to this plant. But we're going to continue surveys of potential habitat. We're conducting pollination studies, and there's work to be done to communicate about needs for infrastructure along the road, continuing to monitor the fence, make sure vehicles aren't running over the plant. I'm also working next, I want to learn more about how, rather than looking specifically at the permanent transects every year, I'd like to look at abundance across the population and how that might vary every year. So we're looking at implementing a grid system to estimate abundance range wide. And then there's also a series of piezometers at the site, shallow wells that are measuring groundwater at a relatively shallow level. And that work has been done by the Amargosa Conservancy. And so that work needs to continue as well, so we can understand what the local groundwater is, what's happening with that. Okay, so that was about the Ambergris nidawort. So now we'll shift gears and talk about the California Plant Rescue, which is an initiative to seed bank the flora of California, which is quite an ambitious project because we have, as you remember, over 6,500 kinds of plants. And so to have every taxon that can be seed banked in a seed bank takes a lot of work and obviously can't be done by any one institution. And so that's why we've undertaken this collaborative project. And so seed conservation is really something that's very significant and relatively inexpensive. And I'm not gonna say it's easy because it's actually takes a lot of work, but something very tangible that we can do where we reap a lot of benefits. So one is every seed is a potential plant. It's a genetically distinct individual, and you can store a very large number of very small individuals in a relatively small space for relatively little cost. Our seed bank is primarily made up of chest freezers. It's not any kind of fancy freezer. They're just regular chest freezers. And this is a really important piece of work where it's an insurance policy where we're basically hedging bets against extinction. We're wanting to store this diversity in a secure location offsite, because we're in a time of global change and catastrophic things happen. And this is an important insurance policy that we can put in place. It's also, we don't intend for these seeds just to live in a seed bank for the rest of their lives. They are living beings and they will eventually die, whether it's 100 or 1,000 years from now, but they do have a lifespan. And so it's really important that we utilize these seeds and enable them to advance conservation. And so we like to think of them as part of an integrated strategy where they complement on-site conservation. And it's also, we get requests very frequently from researchers who can't necessarily access these sites, or maybe it's a sensitive population and we don't want, lots of different researchers kind of coming to the site because it's so sensitive and it might be difficult to collect seeds. So it's we can distribute these seeds for research, of course, when approved by relevant agencies, but it does make the resource more accessible. And it also, along the way, we learn a tremendous amount about plants. We learn about seed predators, we learn about seed viability. If there might be plant populations that aren't producing viable seed, and that is going to be really important for thinking about how we conserve them into the future, and in which case we might need to find other ways to propagate them. So there's just tremendous benefits to seed conservation. And people are doing seed conservation all across the globe and oftentimes doing it in partnership. So Q Millennium Seed Bank has probably one of the most famous seed banks. Svalbard Seed Bank is probably the most famous seed bank, and that's an agricultural seed bank that's located on Svalbard Island in Norway. And so that is for agricultural species. It's not for wild species. So the seed partnerships I have listed here focus on wild species. Q Millennium Seed Bank has a goal to seed bank 25% of the world's plant species by 2025. And they're doing that by collaborating with other organizations. So they're not actively going around the world collecting seeds themselves, but for instance, they came to our botanic garden, evaluated our seed bank, and determined that we were following their best practices. So all the seeds we store in our seed bank can be counted towards their 25% goal. The Center for Plant Conservation is a national network that really have developed best practices and protocols for seed conservation. And the Seeds of Success program, many of you may have heard of, really focuses on common species for restoration purposes. And that's a program headed up, it's an interagency, federal agency, interagency program, but really headed up by the Bureau of Land Management. And so at the California Seed Bank, we participate in a lot of these collaborative, organizations. We're a member of the Center for Plant Conservation. We work on Seeds of Success, and we're working with Q. But we also, our seed bank standalone is the largest seed bank dedicated to California native plants. We have almost 6,000 different collections that represent over 2,000 different kinds of plants, species, subspecies, and varieties. And so this is a picture kind of showing what the seed bank looks like. And it's quite an amazing resource. And so we did an analysis in around 2014. We published a paper in the Journal of California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we did an evaluation of where we were with seed banking the California flora. And one thing that came out of that paper that resulted is that we saw that we had only seed banked 20% of all the rare plant species in California. And we felt like we were falling very short given the need to seed bank rare plants. And so we met with other botanic gardens and we launched a collaborative initiative. And we knew we couldn't do this on our own, and we needed to work in a very coordinated way with other organizations. And we launched what eventually became known as the California Plant Rescue. And so it was officially formed in 2014, and these are our partners. And many of these institutions had been seed banking themselves. For instance, the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden had a well-established seed bank already, as did San Diego Zoo Global and UC Berkeley Botanical Garden. Some of our institutions that are our partners are new to seed banking, but are definitely, so we've done a lot of work to build capacity. And so this organization launched, and we've been coordinating, and we developed a database and we're sharing information. And then as Governor Jerry Brown was ending his governorship and Gavin Newsom was coming into being the governor, passing the baton, I suppose. Governor Brown, he instituted this California Biodiversity Initiative, and I was very honored to be part of a group that was able to talk with the governor's staff to kind of formulate what some of the priorities were, and seed banking was one of those. And we worked with them so they understood and acknowledged that California institutions already had an infrastructure ready and available, and we were ready to hit the ground running to seed bank the rare plants of California. And so we were, the California Plant Rescue was awarded $3.6 million to essentially seed bank all of the rarest plants of California. So those are all of the ones categorized by CNPS as 1B, the California Native Plant Society, as 1B, which most of them are endemic to California. And so with this $3.6 million, we have apportioned about $1 million of it for infrastructure and the rest of it for seed banking. And so the infrastructure component is really important because we need to make sure that our facilities have enough space. So we have enough freezer space, and that they're secure, because these are really important, precious resources. So we're in the midst of doing this project right now, and we'll have until 2025 to accomplish our goal. And we're well on our way. So in 2020, we hit this amazing goal of having 877 of the rarest species in California in seed banks. And so you can see where we started in 2014. We were all the way down here, down below 400. So we more than doubled the number of species present in seed banks. And so we're marching our way up to our goal, which is just about 1,200 plants, different kinds of rare plants that we hope to have in our seed bank. And I feel very confident that we'll reach our goal. And you can see this line here, we were awarded the funding in 2019 to 2020. It really increased our slope and our ability to gain collections. Out here is projected. So this is real data right here. You know, I just think like, wow, what amazing things can we do when we actually have funding to support the work that we need to do. It's really kind of a tremendous thing that we can make things happen when we have appropriate resources available. And so this is a map that shows the seed collections that exist and where they're from. As you can see, we have seed collections from all over the state. The Botanic Garden, my institution is red. So we were Rancho Santa Ana, we're now Cal BG, but You can see we have collections from all over the state, but we're very dense in the transverse and peninsular range, and Mojave Desert outside of military bases and national parks, but we're filling in on national park gaps. You can see San Diego Zoo Global is really dense in San Diego County, and Santa Barbara Botanic Garden has really done well in Central Coast and Channel Islands. So we've kind of done work to kind of divvy up the county based on our specialties and what were, our particular geographic regions. So California Botanic Garden has really continues to work in the transverse ranges out through Mojave Desert and Eastern California. And then we know that there's no seed banking institutions here in the northeastern corner of California. And we hope to have, the pandemic has put a damper in our plans, but one of our goals is to work with land managers here and to basically do a collaborative trip amongst our institutions to come and focus on the Modoc area, because we've identified it as a gap for the state. So, one of the themes I think I'm gonna be hitting on in this presentation is that working in coordination and in partnership really strengthens our work in conservation. I think that this has been, it's an exemplary project of what groups of individuals and organizations can do when we work in close partnership and exchanging information. We're a very well-oiled machine, constantly communicating. And I just think we've been able to achieve a tremendous amount. And so the funding that was secured was really, the California Native Plant Society was really essential to that, and their work especially being based in Sacramento. So we really appreciate them participating with us on that. And then working together, we're expanding capacity by working, we have some institutions that are relatively new to seed banking. And so the more seasoned institutions can provide training and we can build capacity in those institutions. And when we have, when we're able to cross-train and get more institutions on board, it just really strengthens the work of everyone. Okay, so now we're going to transition into talking about teams Buckwheat. Eriogonum teamii. And so we're going to take a little dip out of California right at the edge into Nevada, because this is a species endemic and native to Esmeralda County, Nevada. It was first collected as a botanical specimen housed in a herbarium by Jerry Team in 1983. He sent specimens to Jim Reveal, who was the expert on buckwheats, who described it as a new species in 1985, and he named it after Jerry Team. So that's the name Eriogonum teamii. It's a very, very narrow endemic. It only occurs on 10 acres. It's a very cute plant, long-lived perennial. It's a kind of a cushion plant. So when I say woody caudex, it means it grows from a very short stem that acts what seems like a cushion, and it blooms from May to June. When it's winter time, the plant heads into dormancy. It loses all its leaves. It kind of looks just like a bundle of sticks, but I love this plant regardless. Even in the winter time, it still has charm. So we're just going to zoom in here, and we're going to look where are we at in the world, because we're headed out of California and we're zooming into the very edge of Nevada. You can see California from the site. When you're at the site and you look to the west, you can see the White Mountains. So this is the habitat of Team's buckwheat. And these green polygons are its entire range. This is it. So from here to here is just about 1.5 miles. So you can walk the global range in a day and just take a hike and walk and see the whole, where it occurs in all the world. There is white soils here underneath where all the populations occur. And so this species is a soil specialist. It only occurs on these white soils. And it turns out these soils are highly mineralized and they are rich in lithium and boron. And so the lithium component presents a conservation conundrum, a major conservation issue, because an Australian mining company has done prospecting. They've done exploration in this area, and they are proposing to build a boron lithium mine. And this is their project. This comes from directly from their site and or their information. And so the red is the project boundary, which encompasses the entire range of Team's buckwheat. And the first phase of the project outlined here in blue, would remove 40% of the global habitat and 60% of all known individuals. And if the project were to move to phase 2, it would take out 90% of the whole range. It would leave this tiny subpopulation here and a bit of this subpopulation here. It would render the species functionally extinct, even if it wasn't extinct census-wise. I mean, it would cause extinction of the species. And further, so I came to know about this species in June of 2019, and at that time they were conducting mining exploration, and we learned that they had done some sneaky things where they conducted exploration without going through proper environmental review, because the mining law is very, very strong, and it doesn't favor plant diversity, it turns out, and you don't have to go under environmental review if your project is under a certain acreage. So they divided up their project into 2 parts to keep under the acreage so they wouldn't have to go under environmental review. So that was kind of sneaky. And yeah, so when I first traveled to the site, and I went with a colleague of mine, Patrick Donnelly, who works for the Center for Biological Diversity, it was very clear that this plant had an acute threat. And, you know, I've done a lot of projects with rare plants, working on the Amargus onidawort, done a lot of work in seed conservation, various kinds of rare plant projects, but I've never done a project where I served as primarily in an advocacy role. So I'm not doing necessarily scientific research out here. I'm not setting up the monitoring. I'm not doing the studies, but I'm taking my knowledge, my plant science knowledge, to convey information to say how this project would affect the plant species, and to bring a voice to promote protection, to prevent extinction of a plant species that's irreplaceable. So there are many threats to the species, but the clear and present threat, the primary threat, is mining. And so that would be the exploration that's already been conducted and the proposed mine that will, you know, that they're proposing. And so the exploration, they bladed new roads, they installed test wells, and in doing that, they really exacerbated the spread of invasive species. So this is Heligeton glomeratus, which is surrounding the buckwheat. And it's really, there are surveys that took place in the 90s that didn't indicate that this was a widespread thing, but it is very widespread now. And in fact, you can see how it's been, the roads they bladed through have been a vector for this plant to get into the habitats. Highway vehicle trespass has really increased at the site since we've been visiting. People are just, especially with those roads, these new roads they bladed in, have created access where people are just going off the roads and running over the buckwheat. And there's cattle grazing in the area. And then there was some unprecedented damage that took place in 2020 that I'll discuss a little later. So when I visited that site in June 1st, 2021, I felt certain that I wanted to enlist my scientific services to be an advocate for this plant. And so I signed on with the Center for Biological Diversity on their listing petition. You know, I worked with them on this listing petition to have it listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, because this was a plant that was existentially threatened by this one activity, this mine. And also they submitted a petition to the state of California. And so this was my first foray into botanical advocacy, and I've learned a lot, and it's been quite a journey for me, and learning new and interesting things. I do a lot of work that I feel very comfortable with, like providing scientific review and comment on a variety of documents that might be produced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the mining company. I'm also out there almost monthly. I'm going to be out there in a couple, you know, not too far from now, to do my monthly August check, because we need to do these checks, because it's a very contentious project. There's unusual activity happening out there quite frequently, and you know, somebody's got to be watching out for the plant. And I've also utilized my network to request action from other scientists, to sign on to letters, to bring to light the situation. We've done that a lot by utilizing social media and creating the hashtag Team Buckwheat. So if you want to join Team Buckwheat, let me know. And a lot of the work that I've done has been involved dealing with media inquiries. And so we've had a lot of media hits. This is like the most famous buckwheat on the planet. And the hits, the media stories have been national and international in scope and lots of local news, obviously. I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about this story, you might want to check out this Wired article, which features my work as a scientist getting involved in botanical advocacy, called Lithium versus the Wildflower. It's available online now, but you can also, it's going to be coming out in the print version of Wired magazine as well. It was really cool to see Teams Buckwheat on the ABC News Earth Day special. So that was, you could probably find that on YouTube. So where are we now with Teams Buckwheat? Well, we submitted that petition for listing, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service submitted a finding that they agree that listing is warranted. So that's really good news. But it doesn't mean that the plant is listed yet. It's not listed, and we still have some hoops to jump through. So we're crossing our fingers and hoping for the best that this plant gets listed. And we're still doing our on-site visits very frequently. And then more recently, I conducted the census in 2020 to assess that damage that occurred. So what about that damage? This was really unprecedented, disturbing damage that occurred in the summer of 2020. There's a lot of dispute as to how the damage was caused, but one thing that all parties agree on is that over 50% of the global population was dug up, destroyed, or damaged in some way. It occurred sometime between July and early September of 2020. There's a gap in time where no one had actually visited the site, which is why I now make sure to visit the site once a month. There are thoughts that perhaps humans, foul play could have been involved, and the prevailing hypothesis by agencies is they say that it was a wide-scale rodent damage related to the drought. However, a lot of the evidence that has been presented, and various investigators have gone to the site, and it's actually very inconclusive. People have come up with different possible rodents, or damage was varying, and it was, but one thing is clear, it was very systematic, very targeted, and was only to the buckwheat at the site and nowhere else. Like, it was very specific to the buckwheat. So I think that, that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they made their conclusion. They said it was rodents, but I think it's important to have an open mind to continue to gather information. It'll be important going forward as we evaluate recovery of the species, and we understand what recovery actions need to take place, and also that hopefully we can prevent this from happening again. So there's still a lot to learn, and I would not say, if you tried to pin me down and say, what do you think happened? I would, I really don't know. It's been a very confusing process, but I'm not convinced that it was completely done by rodents. So when we did the census, and just notes that, so there are 8 subpopulations of Teams Buckwheat. I only have 5 listed here, the 5 largest that actually show up as bar graphs. So the gray bar is the original estimate prior to the damage in 2019, and that was extrapolated based on transects. They extrapolated a full population size. And then this is we did a total census. So the red bar is my total census. And then the light gray bar is the estimate of number of plants that were based on the damage, like what would have been remaining, what would have been undamaged. And we can see that the census, there's definitely been a decline, but it's also hard to know if some of the original estimates might have been a little overestimated. For instance, subpopulation 4, there was an estimate of some level of damage, but with that estimate, 3,000 plants should have remained, but we only counted 649 plants, and this was all extrapolated based on the 2019 numbers. So some of the subpopulations may have been overestimated, but we now estimate a global population size of about close to 16,000 plants, whereas before the global population size was estimated to be 44,000 plants. So that's quite a decline. So we have several conservation goals for this species. The first is to shut down the current mining proposal. this mine and the species can't coexist. Lithium, we certainly maybe need, we need to look at developing a domestic supply of lithium, but it shouldn't come at the cost of extinction. So we hope to shut down this mining proposal. We hope that the species will be protected under the Endangered Species Act, and that critical habitat will be designated, and that there will be funding available then to advance recovery, especially related to the damage that occurred. And ultimately, what I'd really like to see is withdrawal of mineral rights at the site so that there isn't this long-term threat of mining. So I think there's a lot of things that scientists and general public can do to support conservation. One is we have a lot of literature and basic understanding of what is best to support populations. And we know that habitat protection is really essential. And this is always preferable over translocation. And this is a hard thing to convey because the mining company keeps promoting that we'll just move the plants. And they haven't demonstrated that they could even have one plant move successfully, let alone thousands. I think financially supporting environmental organizations, the people who have the boots on the ground doing this work, is really essential. And I think a lot of this involves policy. So we need to tell lawmakers that we support laws like the Endangered Species Act, because these are the tools that we can use to ensure that plants are protected. Well, obviously, we need to vote as well. So I want to acknowledge Team Buckwheat. This is the census team that came out with me, and they did the hard work of counting every single buckwheat plant, thousands and thousands of buckwheat plants. And I also want to acknowledge my collaborator, Patrick Donnelly. And this is our little logo for saving Teams Buckwheat. I'm on Team Buckwheat to save Teams Buckwheat. So you can join Team Buckwheat too. And then just to round it out, I just hope that through these little vignettes of different plant conservation case studies and thinking about botanic gardens and conservation, we can all take home that plant conservation is a community level activity. It really takes a village. It takes scientists and institutions working together and working hand in hand with land managers to really facilitate strong conservation outcomes. And we can't do it without public support. We really need public awareness and support. And also we can have public participation, whether it's through iNaturalist observations. Those are really valuable. And there's just so many ways the public can participate in conservation. And I think advocacy has an important role in this, messaging to the media and providing that scientific messaging and providing that information to policymakers is so essential to ensuring that we can conserve biodiversity into the future. And so I know that as a community, we have a lot of people who care and we can do this. And so I have a lot of hope that we can do important things in California. In particular, I've learned that California has an incredibly strong conservation and plant community, people who are invested in the diversity here. And so I know that California can serve as a role model for other places in the region to achieve strong conservation outcomes. So with that, I thank you. That's my presentation. There's my contact information. And I've worked with a lot of people, and this list of thank yous should be very, very long, but I didn't have enough room on the slide. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fraga. That was an excellent presentation. Very, very informative, as all the comments are indicating. Now we're going to entertain questions that have been placed in the Q&A, and you can continue to place questions in there, but for now, Colin Barrows will be looking at those questions and sorting them out with Naomi and seeing what we come up with.
Nope, that was a little quiet there, but I think we're ready to start with questions. So folks, go ahead. We've got some questions going already. If you have more, please add them now. I had a question about sort of the trade-offs of conservation of these rare species and of the things like the lithium mine, right? So we were mining lithium for electric car batteries and stuff like that. So it's a climate change mitigation strategy, right? And somehow we have to make these trade-offs. So hopefully maybe you as a botanist who's concerned about both the team's buckwheat and about climate change, how do you sort of navigate that distinction?
Yeah, no, sure. That is part of why Teams Buckwheat has been very prominent in the news, is that it's this really difficult sort of conflict where we do need lithium for batteries and we need to address and avert climate emergency. But it's sort of, yeah, what are the trade-offs? What are the costs? So I'm actually working with a group right now with the Nature Conservancy to identify potential resource conflicts related to lithium mining. So lithium, there's like a lithium gold rush happening, especially in Nevada, and sites in California. And I think that to sort of set our sights on mining without understanding the potential consequences is to sort of replay the mistakes of the past in our extractive ways. And we need to be thoughtful about it, and we need to have planning. I mean, it's a simple planning process, and it's looking at maps, and it's mapping resources and identifying conflicts and identifying best sited locations. It's not perfect, but we have the DRECP in California, and there was work done to identify where there were less resource conflicts, and that planning, is not being done with respect to lithium mining. And I just say we make a plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one more question from my end, and then we'll get to the Q&A, which has got some good questions coming up. This is sort of curiosity on my part. Is there any difference in your mind in sort of the conservation of plants that are widespread, in terms when it comes to climate change or things like that, and those really rare plants? Are there different strategies or different priorities that you bring on each of those kind of scenarios?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think we want to conserve the whole of it. The really common plants, provide essential habitat values, oftentimes for the rare plants, maybe even, and obviously for wildlife. And so I think we need to be looking at everything. The rare plants have had a unique focus for me because to me they're the most vulnerable, and they're the canaries in the coal mine, and they give us sort of early indication of shifts and change in our environment. And so by studying those, we can kind of anticipate what might be in the future for some of our common species. But we do a lot of common species conservation as well. Like I said, we participate in Seeds of Success, and we're collecting seeds of common species because we really, in the past, the agencies have used non-native species to rehabilitate areas, and we don't want that. And we are really concerned about contamination and also in collecting local ecotypes and seed transfer zones. Where do you move seed? How far do you move seed? And making sure we're not contaminating areas with inappropriate genotypes. But also, just understanding shifts in the landscape and how common species are shifting and what we can do to kind of support those common species. I think it's all important.
Great. Okay, so we have some questions in the Q&A. And first one is, when it comes to the seed banking and growing things maybe out of their original habitat, are there endemic plants that don't adapt well to that process? Or maybe talk a little bit about how that process works, trying to take something from the wild and put it into a botanic garden setting?
Yeah. So, at the California Botanic Garden, there are a lot of plants we're probably not going to be able to grow at our garden because we're in a hot inland garden. And so, for instance, we're also experiencing global change at our garden where in the past we were able to grow a diversity of manzanitas, and we had a significant die-off of a lot of our Arctostaphylus species when we were in the drought between 2013, that started in 2013. So I think we need to think about climate adaptation for our garden and what species are appropriate for us to grow, because we're not going to be able to grow everything. But there are certainly species that really thrive in the garden, that especially from desert locations where they actually might appreciate a little bit more precipitation. And then definitely some things that don't do as well. With respect to seeds, they're oftentimes very adaptable, and most of our seeds can be dried down and stored and frozen, but some can't. So like oaks can't. And so we have a very extensive collection of oaks, and we actually do really well with oaks in the garden. So it's really species dependent, but yeah, we grow as many as we can to stay the diversity.
Let's say you have a species that you have collected but won't grow, in your botanic garden, do you try to like trade with other organizations or other botanic gardens, that kind of thing?
Yeah, we do exchange. And we also do it as a backup as well. So especially if we have some things that aren't very prevalent in botanic gardens, we'll send duplicate specimens to other institutions. So we're backed up in other locations. So it's a distributed network of growing.
Right. You mentioned the seed bank in Norway, which is supposed to be using the ice caps as their backup refrigeration system, right? So what's your backup refrigeration system in case the power goes out?
Yeah, they're guarded by the permafrost and they're like underground.
Right.
So because we use electricity in freezers, we have a backup generator. And it's actually, we're doing a 3-way backup now. We have, it starts off with natural gas, and then if natural gas needs to shut off, then it goes to propane. But then now we're looking to institute solar panels as well with battery backups. So we're all the different kinds of backups. And in addition to electricity backup at our site, we also have a physical backup of a portion of the seeds are stored at a USDA facility in Fort Collins. So.
Great. Let's see. There was a couple of questions I think about the seed banking and restoration projects as it relates to wildfire. And so I don't know if your work relates to that at all, but maybe you could speak about how the seed banking and wildfires, especially this season, as the wildfires start to heat up.
Yeah.
What the story is there.
Yeah, the wildfires have really impacted our work, especially with seed banking. So last year we were making good progress, and then there were forest closures. And so we couldn't actually implement our work. There were large fires. We do a lot of work in the San Bernardino National Forest, and there were 3 large fires on the San Bernardino National Forest and minimally 2. There were like 3 fires also on the Angeles National Forest. So that greatly impacted our work. We also work very coordinated way with the agencies. So we're doing a lot of post-fire surveys, identifying invasive species and mapping them. And we're looking at the rare plant populations to see how they're doing. So checking on how things are recovering. And definitely if a population has been greatly impacted by fire, or if the population isn't robust and doing well, we won't collect seeds. We are very conservative in our seed collection and make sure we don't collect too much. We have very stringent protocols. So this year has been not a great year for seed collecting because of the drought. Because if the population is not doing well, we'd rather the seed stay with the population in this dry time, and that we can come back another time when they're doing better.
Okay, so there was a question locally. There's been a lot of talk about lithium mining around the Salton Sea. Are you familiar with any of the rare plant species in the Colorado Desert around the Salton Sea area?
I am familiar with some. I'm not sure that specifically in the proposed lithium areas that there would be rare plants in those locations. They tend to be in rockier locations, the rare plants in that area. There are surely potential issues with lithium mining in all different locations, and rare plants might not always be the issue. And I don't think in that instance, the Salton Sea site would have major rare plant issues. Right.
I mean, a lot of the Salton Sea shoreline probably was underwater a lot over the last few thousands of years. So there's probably not a ton of really rare plant species. There's a milkvetch that's in the area that's rare, but not right. But that's not confined to the Salton Sea, right?
Right.
Yeah. Let's see. And then there was more questions about Teams Buckwheat. It's definitely striking a chord with folks. And if folks are interested in Teams Buckwheat, I would definitely recommend following Naomi's Twitter account, which covers a lot of the Team Buckwheat stuff, and it's really just all around good. Let's see, but there was a question about whether there are close relatives of the Teams Buckwheat, and a real specific question about whether the soil type, you think the soil type, or whether you know what the soil type is, what caused the species divergence?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions still about Teams Buckwheat and its origin. So I think that's one of the burning questions is what is the age of Teams Buckwheat? How long has it been there? How long has it been evolving at this site and been isolated at this site? And what is its closest relative? So we don't actually have the answer to those questions yet, but we do know that the group that it occurs in, there's a group of buckwheats in Eriogonum subgenus Eucycla, where there are these cushion forming buckwheats that have the yellow heads, and they look very similar to Teams buckwheat, but they're adapted to these funky soils and they're like scattered around. They're really rich in Nevada, but the next closest population of a buckwheat like that is quite distant and far away, and Teams buckwheat is very, very isolated. And so it's not known exactly what species is the closest relative, but there is proposed research to investigate that. But the other thing is there's a professor, a scientific researcher, his name is Ben Grady, and this is his group, his specialty. And this is like, I think, his burning question, his burning research question for his life is how to decipher the little yellow-headed buckwheats that are so difficult to identify. And there's probably other undescribed species, and it's just very hard to tease apart. And many of them are very narrow endemics. So that's something to watch out for, new information that hopefully will be forthcoming. But we do know Teams buckwheat has a characteristic of having these stalked glands on the outside of the tepals. They're a combination of sepals and petals, and they're called tepals. And that's a very unique characteristic. And so it has this kind of unique morphology that it's able to be distinguished from other buckwheats. So there's not really a question about whether or not it's distinct. It's just sort of more the curiosity of how it got there and how long it's been there and what is its closest relative.
Yeah. So somebody wants to know, or probably more than one person wants to know, what are the qualifications for joining Team Buckwheat? What does it take to join?
Yeah. To join, you can email me and say, we have a list, and if there's actions in the future, we email that list and ask people to sign on, to letters of support or, what have you. So the qualifications are to have an interest in want to see Teams Buckwheat conserved.
Is there any benefit to be had by like people who want to save Teams Buckwheat by visiting the site, and if that's possible?
That's a good question. So there has been a lot of activity out there because a lot of people have been curious about it, and so there's been increased sort of trampling. I think there's been different people who have done. So there's a podcast of a fellow named Joey who has a podcast, Crime Pays, but Botany doesn't. He was out there and filming. And so there is quite a bit of activity out there, but I guess I would like to see the plant kind of recover. And I try when I'm out there very ginger about like where I step and not wanting to trample plants. It's quite a sensitive site. So I wouldn't want to ever, personally, I imagine like, I wouldn't want to take a field trip out there of like, because, you get 30 people out and everyone can't always watch where they step, but.
Yeah. And then one more on Teams Buckwheat. Do you have Teams Buckwheat in the seed bank at the California Botanic Garden?
They're not at the California Botanic Garden, but they are at Ray Selling Seed Bank in Oregon. I don't know how many seeds they have left. They did an original seed collection in 2019, and some of those seeds were used to propagate plants for an experimental translocation. And I don't know how many seeds remain, but I suspect that probably additional seeds should be collected specifically for conservation purposes. Whether or not they would come to our seed bank, it depends on whether or not I might propose to do future seed collection or if someone else does seed collection and where they decide to deposit them.
Great. Okay, so I think we're kind of up against our time. We have a few more kind of real specific questions that I think I would encourage folks to, again, reach out to you through Twitter or through the contact information you posted. But maybe we could just finish up with sort of, if there's like one thing that we could do after the presentation today or tomorrow or sometime in the next few days to help support native plants in California, rare plants in California especially, what would you be the sort of like the one thing?
Oh my gosh.
Tough, right?
I would say donate to your favorite plant organization.
What's
Yeah.
your favorite plant organization? I mean, obviously.
Oh,
I
well,
guess
the California Botanic
Yeah.
Garden.
There we go.
You know, these nonprofits, we operate on a shoestring budget, and you know, we get support from contracts and grants and agreements and these sorts of things, but the core support, the unrestricted support, sometimes can be hard to come by. They're oftentimes project-based, and so I think making sure that these institutions are well supported so that they can do the good work to get boots on the ground and make sure that plants, you know, that there are people looking after these plants.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've donated to the California Plant Botanic Garden before, and also to Mojave Desert Land Trust, which was on one of your slides.
Yep.
They do seed banking in the Mojave Desert, absolutely, and turn some of those seeds into plants that we can put in our yards. A lot of the plants in my yard are from the Mojave Desert Land Trust, so it's a really valuable resource. So
Definitely.
All right, folks, that's going to do it for us tonight. I want to thank you all for joining us, and especially thank Dr. Fraga for presenting to us and sharing with her passion for rare plants with us. Our next Wild Coachella lecture is on native bees. So it's a nice follow-up to the native plants, native rare plants, which I believe is on September 2nd. But I think you can sign up for that already. And if not, I'm sure you'll be getting emails from UCR Palm Desert about signing up for that soon. So have a good night, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you.